Hello and welcome to this video. In 1992, the great guitarist Alan Holdsworth released an album called Wardenclyffe Tower. This album explored the areas that Alan had been exploring since he released his first solo album in 1979, and that was the juncture between jazz, rock, improvised music, the guitar, electronics, and on its release, Daniel Jeffrey at AllMusic awarded Wardenclyffe Tower 1.5 stars out of 5, describing it as formless and not very compelling. It opens with a track called 5 to 10, and this is standard Holdsworth. It comes out incredible playing, as far as I'm concerned, incredible improvisations, an incredible relationship between Alan and the rhythm section. And it goes on improvising, pulling things out of the hat that no guitarist had ever done before, or perhaps even since. Is this the formlessness to which this critic has alluded? Towards the end of that track, we are transported into some toilet in some small music venue somewhere. And we imagine that we can hear Alan Holdsworth in the toilet. And somebody turns around and they say, "Jazz? I hate jazz." Now, what does this mean? When I heard it, it was almost sarcastic and resigned to Alan's lot to spend his time as perhaps not only one of the greatest guitarists on the planet, but also one of the greatest improvisers of the planet, traveling from one toilet to the next to play music that nobody liked. There is an inference that whoever has come to this club cannot categorize what Alan's doing as jazz. So he's obviously going to say, well, what do you play? And Alan said, well, we play jazz, I suppose. And he goes, "Jazz, I hate jazz." But there's the inference that he could like what Alan's doing. This idea that if people did not have that description, that genre, that title, that label, that box, that in some way maybe people would come to the music with different ears. So the label of jazz is a blessing and a curse. Recently, I've been making a lot of controversial videos where I've been exploring the the origins of jazz. I'll do the oranges later. And it's been really interesting because we've been arguing who created jazz and all this sort of stuff. And of course, I've had a lot of pushback from people saying, well, jazz is the black classical music of America. It was created by blacks, from the suffering and racism of America. That sort of narrative has come out. The elephant in the room with all these discussions is I'm sat there listening to it all and I'm thinking, I wonder what percentage of black Americans listen to jazz. Because we all know who turns up to a jazz gig nowadays, if you do go to one, right? And I'm not going to racially categorize that audience, but I'll tell you who they are. It's a middle class, educated, quite elitist group. Jazz is not seen as being something from the street. It's not seen as saying anything that's important culturally. It's a little bit like opera. It's a badge that certain people wear to show that they are sophisticated. Years and years ago, jazz moved over to the sort of sophisticated realm. It became the coffee table book of music. This happened a long time ago, and I am trying to push back on this channel, right? Because we've got to remember where this music comes from. But it doesn't really matter whether we remember where it comes from or not, because the fact is most people hate jazz. Most people have a difficulty with jazz. When I was a kid, I was really into film, and I was really surprised that my school friends would not watch a black and white film. And as soon as a black and white film came on, or a film with subtitles, they automatically switched off. This is precisely the same effect that jazz has on 90% of the audience, 95%, 98, 99. How many people actually like jazz out there? Okay, now, vocal jazz, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, this has sold in the millions. And I think that that has a certain sort of almost like cabaret aspect to it. A certain person who is actually very conservative in the middle of the road will have a tendency nowadays to love that type of music. It represents a chocolate box view of the world in the 1940s and 50s where everything was so much better. We can discount that lot, can't we? Should we just take those out of the mix? And then there's people who are cool and they like the idea of those Blue Note record sleeves, you know, and they're more interested in having, like me in the background, a picture on the wall that sort of denotes the smoky nature of jazz being played in a jazz club. As I went into this, I realised that I'm doing exactly that, and I've got that there behind me. You know, you know, by having this picture on the wall and maybe in the back of this video, it gives me an air of sophistication. Oh, and he's a proper jazz fan. Look, he's got that picture of John Coltrane on the back. You know, it's a painting as well. It's art. It's, you know, it's not just a poster. So, can we discount all those people who just like to be associated with the smell of jazz, the coolness of jazz, the idea of having a Miles Davis album propped up against your turntable and showing how sophisticated you are and how you can appreciate Kind of Blue on the special pressing that you've got, which is probably in mono, and you can play it through your very expensive, you know, valve amplifiers, you know, and appreciate the beauty and skill that was required to make this album back in 1959. Jazz has got something awfully elitist about it. And for most people, it's a turn-off. When we discuss jazz on this channel, that is the elephant in the room. But there's so much more than that. Probably the greatest statement about jazz was uttered by the wizard of contemporary culture, Homer Simpson. On hearing a jazz piece, he turned around and went, "Pfft, jazz, they just make it up as they go along." As though that was somehow, you know, some sort of insult, some sort of critique. And then he goes on to sing Mary Had a Little Lamb, but without any lyrics. Right? Now, us jazz fans can scoff of that, can't we? We can laugh at that because of his stupidity of not understanding it. But most people laugh at it because they feel, yeah, it's about right, isn't it? I mean, what is going on? Some guy stand up there, you know. I mean, my daughter could do that. She's just started playing the piano, and she just, I mean, the other day my cat was running all over the piano keys, and it just sounded like jazz, you know. Yesterday I saw, it was a video of two little kids on Christmas Day. They got a toy saxophone and a toy trumpet, and they just blowing these random notes. And then somebody had put underneath it, anyone who has heard Uncle Meat by Frank Zappa knows exactly what I mean, all right? I'm very aware of this, and I want to really, on this video, try to get into the weeds about it. I want to express this. If you're watching this, you may be a jazz fan, or you may be someone who absolutely hates jazz, and you're thinking, well, let's see if this guy's going to really agree and tell us how all rubbish it. And I am sort of. I've sort of pointed out some of the nonsense around jazz. Why don't people like jazz? Right? I think part of it is because the music's difficult. This is the easy answer that I could just do in 2 or 3 minutes. The music's difficult. You have to have an understanding of it to understand how it works. That might be just a basic explanation of what's going on, but having some actual musical theory knowledge, or maybe understanding of the technical aspects of playing music, will give you an appreciation of the skill level required, which normal people can't hear. And then on top of that, jazz has been its own worst enemy, and I want to get into how that's happened. So we've got to this point where it has become so elitist and snobby and snotty that any self-respecting normal person, you know, when hearing it, their detector can tell them straight away what they have suddenly come across. And what they've come across is, that's what they've come across. It's so clever. I was listening to the Thelonious Monk last night. Was it the album with John Coltrane on? Oh yes, that was a very interesting period of for Thelonious Monk, because I felt that John Coltrane, he really developed under Monk's tutelage. I agree entirely. It's an incredible album and underrated. I mean, everyone's listened to, kind of Blue from that period, or maybe Mingus and really, I've heard those so many times before, when you really need to hear them again. But, the John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk album, it's a very special album. It's a precursor to what you heard John Coltrane would have done on albums like My Favourite Things, and eventually the genius that is A Love Supreme. Oh, A Love Supreme is one of the greatest albums ever. Oh, yes, it is, isn't it? Right, that aspect of jazz, the snotty, snobby aspect of jazz. And I may fall into that category sometimes on this channel when I wax lyrically about how much I love that. I love jazz, and this is going to be part of the discussion here. Right, so where do we start? Why do people hate jazz? Well, it's a really strange one. Jazz, fundamentally, is the root of all 20th century Western popular music. Of course, there's other influences in there. Of course there are. But jazz is so important that by the time we start to hear recordings of jazz, which is where our idea of the music industry comes from, jazz has touched absolutely everything. All right? Jazz grows out of a number of different styles. The idea of giving it this sort of black-centric narrative, which I have pushed against, of saying, jazz was created by black people in New Orleans. The reason why I push against that is because anyone with a brain that listens to jazz will hear a multiplicity of influences in there. Marching music, brass band music, ragtime, the blues. You will hear elements of Spanish music in there, of Latin music, of folk music. It just goes on and on and on. There's so many influences in there. We're listening to a band which is basically that starts off as being growing out of a marching band. And it has those sorts of marching instruments in there. We've got the clarinet, we've got the trombone, we've got the cornet, we've got the sort of percussion, the snare drum and the bass drum. But it all marries up with aspects of stride piano. So you have the piano in there. There's with early jazz in the 1890s, the guitar was in there because it was close to South America. There was an influence of that, and the guitar, although it couldn't be heard, was often the instrument which would help hold bands together when they were marching. It provided cause. So the thing is, the influences are so vast. There's so many things coming together, and then there is a series of events, inputs, influences that suddenly ends up with jazz being recorded in New York by the original Dixieland Jazz Band as a novelty music, because there's a novelty aspect to this music. There's a vaudeville aspect. And in America, vaudeville and sort of comedy music, which is why the original Dixieland Jazz Band was recorded, is coming out of minstrelsy. Minstrel music is coming out of blackface. And minstrel music was the most popular entertainment form in America from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. The biggest star, undoubtedly, of the first half of the 20th century was Al Jolson, who was a Jewish man with a black face, pretending to be a black jazz musician. Al loved jazz. But on the other side, the great genius of the early 20th century, the guy that really takes jazz, which I believe is a multicultural art form, and puts the stamp of black excellence onto the form, is Louis Armstrong. And he does this in the 1920s as the Harlem Renaissance is happening, and certain thinkers start to realize that what Louis Armstrong is doing is beyond the comedy music of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, or the sort of visceral Dionysian quality of the New Orleans marching band. There's a sophistication to that music. But Louis Armstrong is almost like the antithesis to Al Jolson. He is a poor black kid that has grown up in New Orleans, but has been brought up partially by a Jewish family. It's very interesting that no one ever says that. Take Al Jolson, Louis Armstrong. There's like a yin and yang there, right? Louis Armstrong emerges in the 1920s. So what he's doing is absolute genius. This is one of the reasons why I push back against this idea of jazz being black music, because I think it denies actually what Louis Armstrong did in the 1920s. I can't think of any other musician that's equal to it that did what he did. I think if Louis Armstrong hadn't come along and done what he did with jazz, jazz would have been this sort of interesting folk form that was no better than all the other folk forms. It would have been quite entertaining, but that was it. We just passed by like any popular genre does. But what Louis Armstrong did is he created something that was so high artistically that it made jazz stick. But Louis Armstrong was an entertainer. The other day I saw on, I think it was on BBC iPlayer, it might still be there, a concert of Louis Armstrong that he did in the 1960s. And I thought, I'll watch this because I'm fascinated by him. I'm fascinated by a guy that was born in New Orleans in 1900s, that was a contemporary of people like Freddie Keppard, Kid Ory, and King Oliver, Joe Oliver, that even before he died in the 1960s and almost the 1970s, he was still having massive hit records because Louis Armstrong embodies popular music. His innovation is so important to jazz, and without Louis Armstrong there would be no bebop, there would be no cool jazz, there would be no hard bop, there would be no free jazz, there would be no Miles Davis, there would be no jazz rock fusion. He is perhaps the biggest influence on that, but he is also the father of popular music. In the 1920s, as jazz emerges, these records are popular. This is why we call the 1920s the jazz age. And these records are selling by the millions, right? We look back at this through a sort of lens of the contemporary culture. And we want to look back to, records by Charlie Patton and Blind Lemon Jefferson, not realizing that we talk about those because they were sort of discovered in the 1960s when, white British blues musicians went back and started to explore into that area. But the important artists actually in the 1920s would have been Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Mamie Smith, Leroy Carr, and urban blues, which pulled together blues and jazz in this new group, which was a jazz group, which took the frontline New Orleans Dixieland approach, added a rhythm section, went to the recording studio and started to do stuff that was really sophisticated. All popular music is rooted into that moment in the 1920s, and Louis Armstrong is so important. If you listen to a Louis Armstrong record, you will hear him narrating and joking and chatting. Those albums, those singles, because they were singles, those songs, those 78s, when they open up, sometimes you'll hear Louis chat and he'll talk. You'll say, oh, I feel like this. What's he doing, Louis? Oh, we're going to do this, and then then the tune starts up. And in amongst the genius of his playing is also his singing, which is genius. I mean, Louis Armstrong is also setting the stage for the contemporary 20th century popular music singer, someone that doesn't sing like Caruso, that doesn't have a perfect voice, but has personality and puts their personality in the record and shapes the record underneath what they do, with little ad-libs and vocalizations which make it them. So when you put the record on and you hear that voice, you go, oh, that's Louis Armstrong, or that's Frank Sinatra. We go, well, that's a James Brown record, isn't it? Oh, that's the Bee Gees. That's a Madonna record. You hear by the idiosyncrasies, right? This influence is all pervasive. But as you could see, jazz at this time has in its DNA not just, things that would make it popular. It's actually invented popular 20th century music. This is where it comes from. Jazz that has that in bucket loads. It has a swagger, it has a rhythm, it has a groove, it has an element of danger, it has an element of darkness, it has an element of light. It's funny, and it's serious at the same time. It swings, it's cool, right? This is the thing. You know, you're a young person in the 1920s or the 1930s, and what do you want to do? Listen to light operetta, you know, or do you want to listen to something that's cool? Do you want to go up to the dance club and dance to this stuff, you know, and see, you know, Lindy hoppers jumping around, their skirts flying up around there, and see their legs and all this type of excitement that's associated with jazz? The Chicago style, which is actually, again, innovated by both black and white musicians in the 1920s. The Chicago style is really important to the development of jazz. I think if we hadn't had the Chicago style, we would not be talking about jazz now. That is the basis that swing jazz is based upon. By the time we get to the 1930s, jazz is not only the biggest music form on the planet, but it's the first all-encompassing music form. This has never happened before. This is the first popular music. Out of that comes that lineage from Louis Armstrong to the big bands of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Fletcher Henderson, but also Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, the Dorsey brothers. And then through that, we have singers like Al Jolson that then move on to people like Bing Crosby. And remember, Bing Crosby started in blackface, and then Frank Sinatra, and then Elvis Presley. And what does Elvis Presley bring in? You know, what does Chuck Berry bring in? What they do is they start to take jazz, which has become rhythm and blues, and they start to pull in aspects from country music and gospel music. But you've got to remember that gospel and country are all emerging in the 1920s. And because jazz is already so big at the time, they go and just grab jazz rhythm sections. This also applies to the blues. All those stuff, it all happens together. So by the time we listen to, say, you know, Jimmy Rogers, he is singing the blues. There's like jazz lines in there. There's a rhythm section that's swinging often, or the intimation of swing underneath it. Jazz is all encompassing. Everything else is folk forms. If you take a folk form and you touch it with jazz, you get the popular music forms that emerge in the 1950s. So why is it that the genre that creates popularity, right, that people seem to love instinctually, ends up being this esoteric thing that nobody likes nowadays? Well, if we look at the generation of Louis Armstrong, so they're born between 1900 and 1910, that is the generation that really create the swing boom. By the time we get to the late 1930s, right, 1940, the new jazz musicians that are coming in have been born around about 1920. Thelonious Monk was born in 1917. Charlie Parker was born in 1920. I think Dizzy's 1917. So it's all a generation later. Charlie Parker's dad could have been Louis Armstrong. So these musicians have grown up listening to the swing bands, and they have been able to identify the genius that Louis Armstrong established, that the Harlem Renaissance pointed to, that the Hot Club of France, you know, and all those people in Europe suddenly turned around and said, this is incredible. This isn't just pop music. This is mind-blowing. And musicians are coming up and they're hearing people like Bix Beiderbecke. They're hearing people like Benny Goodman. They're hearing people like Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Count Basie, Joe Jones. There's a whole bunch of musicians, and these are virtuoso musicians. In the early 30s, jazz produces the great virtuoso of the 20th century, which is Art Tatum. Art Tatum is playing popular songs. He is playing stride piano and playing popular songs at the time, but he's using the techniques that have been established by Louis Armstrong and jazz in a virtuoso way. He is actually taking it and pushing it to a level which even to this day has not been surpassed. Once Art Tatum emerges, we start to see sort of the equivalents of Art Tatum's emerging in all the different styles and on all the different instruments. And these musicians, as they come to fruition in the late 30s, early 40s, they look to that generation who have their feet in minstrelsy, that are able to put on to show to entertain people. Then they go, well, I don't want that. I want to do something serious. Now, this comes out of a very noble. It comes out of a very noble ideal that those black musicians at that time wanted to be taken seriously. They perhaps looked at Louis Armstrong and goes, well, we know he's amazing, but look how everyone sees him. He's just a gurning, smiling, doing his handkerchief, and Louis Armstrong suddenly became passé to that generation. And that thinking created bebop. And bebop took all the minstrelsy out of jazz. It took all the entertainment, all the vaudeville, all the Al Jolson, it took out of jazz. They would stand in the club and not move with their suits on, like you can see that painting behind me, and they would play the tunes. The tunes were fast, so you had to play with a virtuoso level. They pushed the harmony, they pushed the phrasing, they pushed everything to make it impenetrable. This wasn't being done out of sort of an elitist point of view. This was like the punk of jazz history. It creates a division. You're either bebop or you're not. We can see after bebop that there is a split in jazz, where you could see that in America, the sort of rhythm and blues aspects of it, people like Louis Jordan, they're making records that are still popular, and the blues, which was not able to become sophisticated like bebop, follows that rhythm and blues aspect. So they start to bring the guitar in. You get Sister Rosetta Tharpe, you get Ike Turner, you get Fats Domino. And when people like Chuck Berry then start to marry that up with country music and little bits of gospel through Ray Charles and all that, we suddenly have in America the basis of rock and roll, rock music. We're on that line. Now here in the UK, it's far more interesting because exactly the same thing happens. My dad was a jazz fan, but in the 1950s growing up, he was what he called a modernist. He was into the West Coast jazz that had grown out of bebop. He was into Jerry Mulligan, Modern Jazz Quartet, Chico Hamilton, Dave Brubeck. That's what he loved. Sonny Rollins to some extent, Miles Davis. That was the stuff he grew up. He was a modernist. And he was actually against what we had here in the UK, which was the trad jazz boom that emerged in the 1940s with people like Chris Barber and Humphrey Lyttelton, a whole host of them. And out of that trad boom, which was really trying to go back and capture what they thought as British people was jazz in the early 1920s, out of that there came an interest in American folk forms, and there was an interest in people like Leadbelly, which ended up with Lonnie Donegan. You get that whole skiffle craze, which is really rooted in the sort of spasm bands of New Orleans. And the skiffle craze, combined with the rock and roll that's coming in, gives British rock and roll another aspect, which eventually turns into rock music. And then these two things move back together, right? So we can see a split on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'm sure this was happening all over the world. Those are the only two worlds that I know. But I think there was a split in the 1940s. And what's interesting is the children of jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, gospel, rock music, funk, all that sort of stuff is rejected as being like the black sheep. That is the dangerous end, right? The music forms that preserved the visceral elements of jazz, the entertainment elements of jazz, are disowned by jazz. A jazz splits from bebop into this elitist world, right? People look to Charlie Parker and they're astonished by what Charlie Parker can actually do as a musician, and they want to emulate him. This is a hero worship, perhaps for the first time, of a musician that dies young and then becomes almost like a saint, or like he's worshipped. He becomes like a Che Guevara of jazz. Myths start to surround Charlie Parker. Oh, he was addicted to heroin, he was this, he was that, maybe I need to become addicted to heroin. There's a darkness there, there's an otherness there, but there is still an elitism. But at that point, the elitism is linked to danger, which is very compelling. Louis Armstrong, it can be seen as that guy that's sort of railing at all the honking rhythm and blues saxophone players that have got his gig. He exists on the fringe. Only people who are clever can understand what he's doing. You have to understand what he's doing. If you don't understand it, you're not part of the club. Bebop is all about being in the club. It's all about wearing berets and having funny beards and talking in your own language. You know, it's all about pushing, you know, it's about that, right? And there's good reason for that. But by the 1950s, this has become almost like ideological. And jazz starts to become a display of sophistication, but with a political intent. The free jazz of the 1960s isn't just about musicians going, oh, can't we just rip up the rule book and do what we want? It's about looking at the status of black people in America in the 1950s and going, we're not free, are we? Jazz might represent freedom, but it represents something within a framework of a sort of white supremacy. How do we kick against that? And so free jazz pushes against the elements of jazz, but also is a statement, it's a scream, and a scream of defiance. You know, probably first exemplified by Max Roach through his Freedom Jazz Suite, which literally has someone screaming. It's a visceral, cathartic reference to a ancient scream. And this is why people feel that jazz is a black music form, right? And with all the pushback that I've had, I'm really surprised no one's actually said that. But of course, by the time we get to that, my point is that jazz has fractured at this point. And there's also other forms of jazz that are equally jazz. So it's really silly to go, I'm going to just only class black free jazz as jazz. So all that white third stream stuff that's happening out of the Tristano school, Stan Kenton, we just try and ignore that. All the European jazz we'll have to ignore, you know, all the sort of jazz that's all around the world we'll have to ignore, because there's all stuff going on. It's a gift of the world, and there's all this stuff happening. And when you deny one aspect of it, you are just acting in exactly the same way as the people who, in the first place, decided that black people were so inferior that they could be enslaved. To me, it's exactly the same intent. And this is wrapped up in the reason why I think people find jazz difficult, because that idea of jazz being a sophisticated music form, stuff happens after the free jazz movement. We go into the second era of swing for jazz, which is the emergence of the jazz fusion group. Suddenly, out of this form, which is like avant-garde and expressive and quite wild, almost like the original Dixieland jazz groups. And you've got to remember that someone like Albert Ayler is actually channeling not just the modern, but he's channeling the ancient. He is trying to plot a route through this music back to his, you know, the slave roots and African roots. He's trying to plot that. But what free jazz does is it creates a way of improvising which matches up exactly with the visceralness of rock. And when you put those two things together at the start, we have some extremely experimental electric jazz coming out of people like Gary Burton, Larry Coryell, Steve Marcus. In the UK, it would be like Graham Bond, and then eventually Miles Davis, Frank Zappa, Tony Winner's Lifetime, and then we have the whole jazz fusion explosion. And suddenly jazz is selling millions. Now, if you are from that snotty elitist point of view, you look around at this, you go, Miles Davis is using rock beats. I know, have you heard his album? Yeah. And he hasn't got, have you seen the cover? I mean, it's all this weird psychedelic stuff on the front. He's got electric guitar and electric piano. Well, what's he doing? Is he doing like jazz? No, he's just playing riffs. Sounds like the Grateful Dead. Way better than the Grateful Dead. Sounds like the Grateful Dead. Why has he done this? Oh, I don't know. Maybe he wants to sell some records. I reckon that's what he wants. He's only doing this to be popular. Yeah, but did you listen to Bitches Brew? It didn't sound that popular to me. It seemed a bit way out. I know it sounds way out and experimental and very creative, but the point is, it sold 500,000 albums. So whatever he's doing, he's being a populist. Oh, just being a populist in itself. That, you know, we can't have that happen in jazz. Jazz is only any good when nobody likes it. Right, so that idea emerges in the 70s. We have this split jazz fusion emerges. It's actually a very creative form. But by the mid-70s, the audience wants to return to something a little bit more visceral. And people who are listening to jazz fusion may well turn their ears towards disco. And disco comes out, and then suddenly the record labels will turn around to all the jazz fusion musicians and say, can you not make another jazz fusion album? Oh, what should we do? Well, we were thinking about dropping you. Really? Yeah, we're going to drop you, I think, and go and get some disco. Well, I might be able to play disco. You know, it comes out of rhythm and blues and funk and soul. I mean, I think I can play it. Yeah, but you're a free jazz musician. Now, let me have a go. And they all had a go, didn't they? And some of them succeeded. Some of them had hit records. People like Herbie Hancock and Narada Michael Walden and Tom Scott. They managed to pull something together. Grover Washington, get a few vocals on, you're having hit records. At this point, it's moved on. And this new generation that's coming up into the 80s, they're growing up and playing in these bands. You know, people like Wynton Marsalis, they're playing in like, you know, Earth, Wind and Fire style bands, you know, and they got the big afros and they're doing all that. But jazz, it's no longer a serious form, is it? Is it really that expressive? Does it express this elitist thing that we are aware of that came out of bebop? I don't think it does. Then in America, the funding changed. In the 1960s and 70s, the arts funding was there for avant-garde music. So if you were making free jazz, avant-garde jazz, you could go and apply for a loan and get some funding. That changes, you know, with Ronald Reagan coming in, the world becomes more conservative. And jazz has to change its narrative at that point yet again. And it goes, well, where is the money? Well, if you were doing something that was educational, maybe like linked to classical music, because they'll always fund the classical music. So imagine something that's educational, is like classical music. And really, you know, we feel a bit guilty about how we treated the black folks in America. So anything that, you know, pushes against that narrative would be really good. But how about, you know, like Duke Ellington, you know, he had like this orchestral thing. I mean, he is like a black classical composer, isn't he? Well, I suppose so. What if we had big band jazz? It's black American classical music. We can develop musicians, young black kids. We can develop them, bring them up, and we can keep jazz alive. What we'll do is we'll put jazz and we'll put it into the museum. This happens in the 1980s. And jazz now becomes a museum exhibit. And who goes to look at museum exhibits? The elites. Right? The elites who have not one jot or idea of innovation, that anything that comes up to them which was new would shock their system, because they're not about new. They're about the system staying the same way, because they don't want it to crumble underneath their feet, do they? They want it to maintain. They want it to carry on. You know, black music forms, that type of culture music, slowly descends back into minstrelsy, which is the modern hip hop and rap. That's what we see there. All under the banner of sort of black empowerment in a way. And then you can point to the genius by looking at this jazz. Musicians like Alan Holdsworth, right, who are emerging in the 1970s, who are not making commercial music, they are not making rock music, are in a terrible situation, because they are actually innovative and there is absolutely no support for them whatsoever. Alan Holdsworth, I can't think of a greater jazz musician of the last 50 years in terms of importance and influence and what he did. As soon as he emerged, because he played electric guitar, the powers that be were like, well, you need to do something like a bit rocky. Can you do something rocky? I mean, we'll hook you up with Eddie Van Halen. We'll get Ted Templeton in, who will, you know, produce your album for you. You can get, you know, your mates with Jack Bruce. Can you get him singing on an album? And that we might be able to do something with that if we push that. No, I'm an innovator. I've got a vision. And so the truly innovative jazz from around about 1975 onwards has not been made, and this is, we're talking nearly 50 years, which is, we're talking half jazz's age, has been made with outside of that mainstream elitist black American classical music view of the world. all right? And anybody, regardless of who you are culturally or whatever, when you hear it, you will get the whiff of elitism very strongly. And this is why people don't like jazz, for all the things that I have described. All the incredible, exciting things that happened organically, right, in the first half of the 20th century became ideological, that became something that we need to bow down to. There became a respect came into jazz, which meant these things cannot be questioned. The greats of jazz became legends, and we can't malign them. We can't criticize them. We can't point out that they weren't very good at this or they weren't very good at that. Can't do it. You know, I've noticed it, and you'll get in trouble for it. A few years ago, I had a blog, and at that time, I'd gone out and I'd done a drum clinic with some kids, and they'd said to me, "Could you give us some tips on how to play jazz?" And I said, "Yeah." And I showed them some little tricks, and that got videoed and it got put up on MySpace. And a jazz drum, I won't mention their name, they just sent me an email. I didn't know them, and what annoyed me is they didn't say "Dear Andy," blah, 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 and they said their complaint. I wouldn't have minded that. I opened an email that just went, "Jazz?" And behind that was the inference of, like, you can't go into some kids and just tell them, like, just some basic thing to get them into jazz. Jazz is really sophisticated. Is that jazz? Jazz? It was that. And I was annoyed by it. So I went online onto my blog and I said, you know, the thing that's killed jazz is elitism, and the thing that's killed jazz is a gatekeeping moral elite that will not let the young people in unless they jump through the hoops of the jazz conservatory and learn to play all the licks that Charlie Parker played. You're not letting them in. All these kids that are into metal and rock and punk, Sonic Youth, all these people that are into hip hop, you're not going to let them in. Right? And if they do anything with the form and innovate with it, you're going to go, well, it's just not, no. And the reason is because you've put jazz in the museum. You see, and once you put something in the museum, you can't go into the museum and find some precious piece of historical art and pull it out and say, what I'm going to do is just draw all over it and add to it. People will go, oh, it's sacrilege. We put that in there for a reason. Right? And so I said, you know, pointed out this was what's happened. And then I said, a message to any young musicians out there. If some jazz snob comes up to you holding a Charlie Mingus under their arm and starts telling you what to do, just turn around and tell them to take that Charlie Mingus album and stick it up their arse. That is what I said. And it upset the people in the jazz world, including one of my heroes, Peter Erskine. And Peter Erskine, who had played with Charlie Mingus, objected to the very fact that a Charlie Mingus album had been allied, had been linked, and he'd been talked about the same sentence as somebody's bottom. Honestly, it was just disrespectful. I know what Charlie Mingus was like as a person. He could well have been not the greatest person in the world. You know, he was a difficult person. Anyone who saw the Charlie Mingus documentary, which I saw when I was a young kid, they made a documentary where they spent some time in his apartment in the 60s. And at some point, the psycho gets a gun out in an apartment and he shoots it off. And the camera zooms in and there's a bullet hole. Totally self-centered behavior. He was just a big-headed, self-centered genius, which most of them are. I know you can't say that. You can't turn around and go, well, that bloke was an idiot. That bloke was this. He was a drug addict. This, you know, it's like we can't say that. You can't push against them. We put them in the museum, and people can sense that. Right? I've come on this channel and said things like, if jazz wants to be saved, it needs to do this, this, and this. But jazz won't be saved. It's over. It's gone. It's an archaic museum piece for people who are sophisticated to stand next to, holding their little glass of champagne and their bit of caviar and chat and feel that by being associated with this, it makes them a better person. That is what jazz is, and that's why people don't like jazz. I love jazz. I am committed to jazz for 2 reasons, and I'll tell you what they are. I love stuff that grooves. I don't want to hear stuff that doesn't groove. A lot of contemporary pop music does not groove. I like stuff that grooves. That's what I like. I might be an old man for liking that, but that's what I like. And I like music that is rooted in improvisation. I like the idea of seeing what that person's got to say. I do not care whether it requires technique or not. I don't care whether they've studied or not. What I want to hear is their personality. If their personality and their vision requires them to achieve a high level of technical excellence, I will rejoice in that. I will find that fascinating. But also, if it doesn't, I am fascinated by that. And the truth is, for most musicians, there is always a sort of virtuosity in somebody who can transmit their being and their individuality in an improvised setting. Because to improvise, you have to be selfless. You have to be. You have to remove yourself from the situation. And in doing that, as John McLaughlin said, we find out who we are. Now, that aspect of music, we must not lose. I really hope we don't. Somewhere, is that right? Is that Papa said? Somewhere, there's some kids in a room and they're playing, right? They don't read music, right? They have listened to a whole bunch of rock songs and they're fed up with just playing Smells Like Teen Spirit exactly the same over and over again. And they're bored. And they start to make something up on the spot. It might be someone sat with a computer. It might be somebody. This is happening all the time. People going, I'm bored. I want to express myself. All right? And they might be able to jump over the contemporary idea that comes from a sort of very Western-centric viewpoint that the only thing that's really worthwhile is something that's written down. All right? If something's written down, then it's important. When people just make stuff up on the spot, it's not as important, really, is it? It's like I just made it up on the spot. I mean, jazz, they just make it up on the spot, don't they? Right? And that post-Western industrialized literate viewpoint of the world denies people the ability to express themselves. I'm not calling for improvised music that is not sophisticated, that hasn't got like a sophisticated approach to harmony or technique. All I'm asking or saying and giving permission to, hopefully anyone's watching this, is to go, you can do whatever you want. What do you hear in your head? What do you want to get out? What's going to make you feel excited? What's the new thing that you could discover on the instrument? Let's just forget jazz, right? Let the black people have it. They can have it. You've got your museum of blackness and it's there. It's yours, right? And the rest of us real musicians, why don't we just move on and start to make music? Because the one guy that's been quoted against me so many times, Duke Ellington, what did he say? There's only 2 types of music, good and bad. Or was it Count Basie? But it was some clever person, wasn't it? Anyway, that, I hope, has been a more realistic and more accurate and more personal discussion about jazz, which I will carry on discussing because I do love the form. I'm at the end of the video. If you like this video, then put a like on it by pressing the like. It's down there now. So if you did like it, just press it now. Yeah, go on. And no, don't not do it. Just press the like now, because you did. If you like the, I'm not saying if you didn't like the video, don't press like. You can press the unlike if you want. But if you did like it, press the like now. Just go and do it now. It won't hurt you. It won't cost you anything. It won't make anything happen to you. It's one click that will show you appreciation for what I do. Go on, because that is very important. I want to be loved the same as everybody else. And then you could show a deeper level of love for me by subscribing to the channel. I've just recently hit 30,000 subscribers. Isn't that incredible? But now that I'm becoming more narcissistic and egomaniacal as a YouTuber. I'm looking at that 100,000 spot, and I'm looking to the guys that have already reached it, and they got that silver plaque thing in the background, right? I don't want this pay to the coal train to try and give me some sort of kudos. I want the silver plaque. That's what I want. When I get that, right, I better get that before I die, because that has become my raison d'etre, to use some French. But what's more important than kudos? Money. So if you want to support me financially, you can become a Patreon. And what happens when you become a Patreon? You can become a free Patreon, right, where you get some stuff for free. But if you pay me a small fee every month, you'll get extra content, you will get involved in my videos, you will get part of the Patreon meet, and you'll get access to my Patreon WhatsApp, which is probably the greatest WhatsApp group in the world, because we chat about music. Well, I don't, I just leave him to it. But if you are a busy person and do not want to get drawn into my world that will just take up all your time, you're a sensible person, but you still want to support me financially, down below I have a link to my PayPal tip jar. And you can just click on that and send money direct to me, straight into my account. I love it. And then I can wake up tomorrow morning and look, and I'll go, ooh, someone stuck £5 in it. And I didn't have to do any work for that. It just arrived. It was just there. Because when I see that, it completely undoes the idea of Marxism, doesn't it? Which I'm always up for doing. This is a joke, by the way. It doesn't, but it's the nice idea that, what did Marx say about Labour and how that is? I don't know. I can't remember. I'm getting fed up with the political stuff. Just want to talk about music. I didn't know when I did this channel it would become so political. But the problem is, you do a video like this, and now I've got a little bit more success, you get all the comments. And because the reach is bigger, in the early days, you had people that were just massive fans. It was like a whole bunch of the same people, and they just went, oh, we love you, Andy. And I went, yeah, I love you too, and I love the fact that you love me. Yeah, but we do love it. Oh, I know. And I would come in and go, oh, I've had the day. Now let's make a nice cup of tea, shall we? And sit back and see the comments. They're like a bath of lovely love, because I want to be loved. We all want to be loved. That's why Taylor Swift is so popular. This is it, because Taylor Swift wants to be loved, and everyone does love her. And they recognise in Taylor Swift. You want to know why Taylor Swift is a massive success? Because she wants to be loved. That's what it is. We all want that. And she's willing to love you back if you love her. And that's all I'm asking you to do for me. I want to be like the jazz prog clever clogs of YouTube, the Taylor Swift version. That's all I want on my channel. That's all I want. Okay? Now, you may have noticed on this video that's about jazz, at the end of it, I am not talking about jazz anymore. I've gone off on a tangent, haven't I? Because my videos are often structured like this. I come on as a title. I say what I'm going to do, right? And I said, like I did today. I came on and said, we're going to do this, this, and this. And then I do that. I do a description of this and explain that thing. Then I have a conclusion at the end. And then at the end, I go off on a tangent. And those who know the channel go, Andy might go off on a tangent on this video. I'm going to stay to the end because he's going to go off on a tangent. And my tangent is about wanting to be loved and how important it is that we feel like we're loved. And the reason is because we no longer, because industrialized systems have to exist with specialization, by us becoming specialized. So those of you who are like, computer programmers, and then you're a plumber, and then you're this and that. Maybe you don't do anything, you're just a consumer. But we have to specialize, and in specializing, we have to live in our little bubble in here, and the sense of community where we get up in the morning and walk into our little village and go and get them some bread from the baker and some, get my horse fixed at the horse fixers. That's gone. And that feeling of community, as you walk down the road and something says, hi Andy, how are you? I'm all right, mate. I'm all right, how are you? How's your kids? They're all right, yeah. My kids are all right as well. What have you been doing today? I've been doing a video about jazz. Now everybody hates it. Oh, I bloody hate jazz. It's the right racket, isn't it? Yeah, well, I know. I'll pretend I don't like it because I want to fit in and I want to be loved, you know. But yeah, you just got to get used to it. Well, you know, getting used to it. I've had a good listen to it. I mean, I got that Robbie Williams album when he did all that Frank Sinatra stuff, and that was really good. I really like that. Is that the sort of jazz you're into? No, it's not like that at all. No. So what are you into? I won't even mention it to you really, because you'll just think I'm an elitist snob and you won't like me. And I want to be loved, you see. I do really want to be loved, and I want you to like me. But I'm talking about an imaginary world where I can walk down the road and get people liking me. And in reality, when I walk down the road, no one looks at me or says anything. And some of the people, when I look at them, I'm scared they're going to try and kill me. We all want to be loved. And that's why Taylor Swift's so important. Nobody who listens to Anthony Braxton feels that Anthony Braxton at any point in his life wanted to be loved. Did he? Poor old Anthony Braxton. He's still around, you know. How old's Anthony Braxton? He's going to be like mid-80s, hasn't he? Oh, he's an anomaly when it comes to jazz. Oh, I do love him. He stands there representing something I can't quite put into words. It's like what Anthony Braxton does is really avant-garde jazz. He's black. There's no blackness in it, so the black people don't know what to think about Anthony Braxton. Everyone else hates it. Sounds really intellectual. Seems like a mathematical equation, but he can't play the changes, obviously, and he can't do all the Charlie Parker stuff. So nobody likes him. Nobody likes Anthony Braxton. At one point, he had to make his living playing chess. Oh, my albums aren't selling. Aren't they, Anthony? No, I've had a new one come out. It's called For Alto. What is it? It's a whole album of just alto saxophone solos. What, no backing? Nah, not really. You playing any good tunes? Like maybe something off Oliver, Food, Glorious Food, something we can tap on? Not really. It's more like it's like an exposition of sort of mathematical space. It's a Pythagorean, rendered in an anti-space. You know. What are you talking about, Anthony? I don't know. I wish I hadn't said that now. So yeah. So what? How did it sell? Well, not very much. Really. Did you get any money for it? Not really. No, not really. Oh, that's not so good. So what do you think they're doing? I'm gonna have to get a job. Doing what? I was thinking of becoming a professional chess player. That's not a job, is it, Anthony? Well, but neither is it making free jazz, solo alto saxophone albums. I just pick the worst jobs. Really do. You're not very good at selling insurance or anything like that? Not really. Nobody likes me. I'm not surprised they don't like if you make albums like that. I know. But my mate, he makes money playing chess. He's got these two kids, Who's that? Oh, he's got these two kids, Tristan and Andrew. He's called somebody Tate. I can't remember his first name. He's a professional. He's bringing his kids up ever so weird, I might do that. Does anybody like them? Not really. I don't know why I'm doing this, really. I don't know why you're doing it, Anthony, either. Nah, not really, but I'll get by. Because they're giving me this funding to do some weird stuff. Are they? Yeah. But you do know in the future they're going to stop all that funding, and you're going to have to pretend that you're like a bebopper from the 1950s and wear a suit and stand there going, oh, I can't really do that. I'm going to be right buggered, aren't I, when that happens? Yeah, you are really. We come up to the hour. There you go. Some Edwards madness for you. There's no other YouTube on the planet that does a comedy routine based around Anthony Braxton. Please realise that. You're not going to get that anywhere else, are you? I'm done. I'll see you on the next video. My big finger is going to now press the stop on my iPhone.